poor girl is forced to marry an ugly old man. Scarred, half-blind, walking with a cane. She signs the papers to save her dying grandmother. She doesn't cry in front of him. She cooks his meals, stitches his coat, and sells her dead mother's necklace to feed her little brother, never knowing someone is keeping count of every sacrifice she makes. Because the old man isn't old. He isn't scarred. And the disguise she accepted without complaint is a test designed by a billionaire who lost faith in every person he ever trusted. She married the worst version of a man she'd never met. She's about to discover she's the only person in the world who passed. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, have you ever judged someone and been completely wrong? I think this one's going to stay with you. Elena Vasquez had learned to lift people without making them feel heavy. It was a skill no one taught you. You developed it through repetition, through years of adjusting your grip, softening your voice, moving slowly enough that a frightened patient could pretend they didn't need you. She'd been doing it since she was 19. She was 23 now, and her hands showed every year of it. She was mid-shift at Bakersfield Gardens Care Facility, helping a 78-year-old named Mr. Okonkwo back from the bathroom when her phone buzzed in her scrub's pocket. She ignored it. She eased Mr. Okonkwo into his recliner, straightened his blanket, and made sure his call button was where his fingers could find it without looking. Then she stepped into the hallway. Mercy Southwest Hospital. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. Abuela Rosa had suffered a stroke. Stable, they said, but stable was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Elena drove to Tulare after her shift instead of sleeping. She sat in a plastic chair outside Rosa's room for 2 hours, then in a billing coordinator's office for 40 minutes. The number the coordinator printed and slid across the desk was $94,000. Elena looked at it. The way you look at something you're not sure is real. She sat in the hospital parking lot afterward and opened her banking app. Her savings total was $2,300. She stared at both numbers until her eyes stopped focusing. That night, she made rice and chicken for Marco, smiled when he talked about his calculus test, and told him everything was fine. "You sure?" he said. He had her eyes, dark and watchful. He always noticed too much. "I'm sure," she said. "Eat." He ate. She didn't. The next morning, her phone rang at 7, a number she hadn't called in 2 years. Hector Medina, her mother's brother, smooth and unhurried, as if time were something that happened to other people. He'd heard about Rosa, he said. He was sorry, he said. And then, without pausing long enough for Elena to respond, he explained that he might be able to help. The terms came out in the practiced rhythm of a man who'd rehearsed them. He would cover the hospital debt, all $94,000, and he would sign over Abuela Rosa's house deed, which had been tied up in his name since their mother's estate. All Elena had to do was agree to a marriage arrangement. A man named Don Augusto Carrillo, elderly, reclusive, scarred from an old accident, nearly blind in one eye, in his 70s. He owned land outside Tulare, a lot of it. His attorneys. Everything was handled through attorneys. A trust called Carrillo Land Holdings had approached Hector about finding a suitable wife, someone capable, someone who could manage a household. "He's never met anyone directly?" Elena asked. "That's how these old landowners operate," Hector said, dismissive. "Privacy. You wouldn't understand." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I don't have anything," she said finally. "You know that?" "Yes," Hector said. And then he said the thing he'd been saving. Said it pleasantly, the way you'd offer someone water. "That's why you should be grateful anyone would take a girl with nothing but calluses and debt." The line hummed. Elena's jaw tightened. She thought about the $94,000. She thought about Rosa's house, the only thing her grandmother had left. The place Rosa talked about returning to the way other people talked about breathing. Without the deed, there was no coming home. There was only a facility, a plastic chair, a call button she might not be able to reach. That night, Elena sat on the edge of Marco's bed and watched him sleep. His second-hand backpack was on the floor by his feet, its straps fraying at both ends. He'd told her not to replace it, said it was fine. He said everything was fine the same way she did. She whispered to him in the dark. She told him she was going to fix it. She told him not to worry. She told him he was going to be okay. Then she went to the kitchen, picked up her phone, and called Hector back. One word: when. The dress was 4 years old and still the only good one she owned. Dark blue, pressed the night before, a little loose at the waist now because she'd been skipping lunch most days to stretch the grocery money. Elena stood outside the Tulare County Clerk's office and told herself to breathe. Hector was already inside, leaning against the counter with his salesman's ease, shoes polished to a mirror shine. He barely looked at her when she walked in. He was watching the door. The groom arrived 7 minutes late. Elena heard the cane first, the uneven tap of it against the tile. Then she saw him, stooped nearly in half inside an oversized coat, thick glasses, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a prosthetic nose that made his face look carved from wax. He walked in a careful, shuffling arc toward the counter, and when he spoke to the clerk, his voice came out as a raspy whisper, dry as paper. Elena's eyes filled. She blinked. She did not let a single tear fall. She signed where the clerk pointed. Her hand was steady. That steadiness cost her something, but she paid it. Hector pocketed an envelope from the groom's attorney before the ink was dry and left without meeting Elena's eyes. Just like that, gone, the way he always was once he had what he needed. Elena helped Augusto, her husband, she made herself say the word, into a dusty SUV waiting at the curb. The driver was a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Ray, introduced as the ranch's longtime caretaker. He said very little. He held doors. He drove the way people drive when they've learned to be invisible. The Carrillo Ranch was 40 minutes south. The gate at the entrance was electronic. She noticed that. The fencing along the drive was new, the posts still pale, the wire still bright. The driveway had been freshly paved, but the main house looked like no one had washed the windows in a decade, and the porch furniture was rusted at the joints, and the garden was nothing but cracked dirt and dead stalks. Elena filed the contradictions away. Old money, she decided. No interest in appearances. She unpacked her single suitcase into a room at the end of the hall. That night she made dinner, rice, beans, a can of stewed tomatoes, and set it on the table for Augusto. He ate messily and said almost nothing. When he finished, he looked out the window at the dark yard, wheezing faintly through his nose. Elena washed the dishes, dried them, put them away. Then she walked to the bathroom, locked the door behind her, turned on the faucet, and cried into her hands until there was nothing left. When she came out, she found Augusto still at the table. "You don't have to stay," he rasped, without looking at her. Elena dried her face on her sleeve. She stood up straight. "I gave my word," she said. She went to bed. Behind the locked door of his own room, the old man sat on the edge of the mattress and peeled away the prosthetic nose, the thick glasses, the cane, set aside. Daniel Carrillo, 31, sharp-featured, dark-eyed, rolled his shoulders back and sat in the silence of what he'd built. He'd built Meridian Global from nothing. Aged out of foster care at 18 with a duffel bag and $200, worked warehouse jobs, logistics runs, learned the industry from the floor up. The company was worth $4.2 billion now. That wasn't the part that kept him up at night. What kept him up was a woman named Priya, 2 years ago, her hand in his across a restaurant table, her voice saying she loved him, every word of it calibrated to the lawsuit she was already drafting. The settlement cost him $60 million. The cost he couldn't price was harder to name. It was the moment he stopped being able to tell the difference between a real smile and a performed one. He tried everything after that. Modest cover identities, vetted matchmakers, a therapist who told him quietly that he was building walls no one could climb. The disguise was the last idea he had, and he'd half hoped, somewhere dark in his chest, that it wouldn't work, that whoever Hector found would take the money and prove him right, and then he could stop looking. He opened a leather journal on the nightstand, wrote the date, looked at the blank page below it for a long moment, closed it without writing anything else. the test had begun. By the second week, Elena had a routine. She was up before dawn, coffee on, rice started, the kitchen radio playing low. Augusto woke slowly and needed time. She'd learned that about him, the way she'd learned everything about her care patients, by watching without making them feel watched. She'd help him into his chair, set his breakfast within easy reach, and give him the newspaper open to the section he actually read, which was not the front page, but the agriculture reports, buried near the back. He was gruff. He snapped when the rice was overcooked. Elena calmly made more rice. He complained that she moved too loudly in the mornings. She moved more quietly. She read to him in the afternoons, news articles, weather forecasts, sometimes sections of the almanac she'd found on his shelf. And he listened without thanking her. She didn't need the thanks. She was used to giving without receipt. The garden was what kept her sane. It was a wreck. Cracked soil, dead root systems, a broken drip line along the back row. But the bones were there. She could see what it had been. She started pulling the dead growth out by hand during her free hours, working the soil with a rusted trowel she found in the shed, talking to it the way she'd always talked to her patients and her plants and anyone who seemed like they were trying not to give up. Augusto watched her from the porch. He never said anything about the garden. She didn't ask him to. Ray came and went quietly, hauling feed, checking the fencing, appearing at the edge of the property and then gone again. He was the most alert ranch caretaker Elena had ever seen. She'd noticed he never stood with his back to a door. She noticed the gate code changed every Monday. She noticed a lot of things and explained them all the same way. Old man, inherited land, let things slide. It was easier than the alternative. Midweek, she found an unsealed envelope on the kitchen counter. It was labeled in careful block letters, property tax, Tulare County. She opened it expecting a bill. Inside was $10,000 in cash. She counted it twice. Then she put it all back, sealed the envelope, and walked it to the small roll-top desk in the hallway, which she locked with the key, hanging from the hook beside it. She returned to the kitchen where Augusto was drinking his afternoon tea and looked at him directly. "That envelope on the counter," she said. "I locked it in the desk." He looked at her over his cup. "Money like that doesn't belong on a counter," she said. "Let Ray handle payments like this. Something that size goes missing, it doesn't come back." She turned back to the stove. "Money doesn't grow back the way tomatoes do." Augusto said nothing. That night, in his room, Daniel opened the leather journal. He thought about the envelope, left there deliberately, an early test he hadn't even announced, something Ray had simply placed without instruction to see what she would do. He thought about what she'd said, the flatness of it, the complete absence of temptation in her voice. He uncapped his pen, wrote one word, underlined it twice. Honest. Below it, he marked the date. Week 2. He closed the journal and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sound of the ranch settling around him, and somewhere down the hall the faint creak of Elena's door as she finally, quietly, went to bed. By week 3, Elena had stopped counting the days, not because she'd made peace with the situation, she hadn't, but because counting made it worse. She focused on what was in front of her, the garden, the rice, the newspapers, Augusto's afternoon tea, the ordinary business of keeping someone else's life running, which was something she already knew how to do. On Tuesday, she drove into Tulare for groceries. Ray followed at a distance the way he always did, close enough to carry bags, far enough to give her the feeling of space. She'd stopped questioning his habits. The market was on Bardsley Avenue, a family-owned place with produce stacked in crates outside. The owner, Luis Vega, was a man in his early 40s with an easy smile and a gold watch that caught the light whenever he gestured, which was often. He'd greeted her warmly the first time she came in. The second time, he remembered her name. By the third visit, he was leaning on the counter like they were old friends. "You look tired," he said, not unkindly. "That marriage wearing on you?" "I'm fine," Elena said. She studied the tomatoes. Luis made a soft sound, sympathetic, she would have thought, if she'd been less careful about such things. He said it was a shame, really. A young woman like her, stuck in a house with an old man who could barely hold a fork. She deserved better. Elena put tomatoes in her basket. He came back the following week with a different angle. He'd heard, he said, from who, he didn't say, that the Carrillo estate was something significant, that a smart woman in Elena's position could protect herself, get ahead of things. He knew people who could help her access certain property records, certain account details. They'd split whatever came of it. 50-50. Elena set her basket on the counter. She looked at Luis Vega for a long, steady moment. "I didn't marry him for what he has," she said. Her voice was calm. Calm enough that the woman selecting oranges 2 feet away turned to look. "I married him because I had no choice, but I'll keep my word because that's mine. Nobody bought that." Luis's smile didn't fall. It just went still, the way a flame goes still before it goes out. Elena paid for her groceries and left. In the parking lot, Ray loaded the bags without comment. He'd been standing at the window. He'd heard every word. That evening, Ray knocked on the door of Daniel's study and gave a plain account. What Luis had said, what Elena had said, the other customers who'd heard her, the steadiness in her voice. He described it the way he described everything, factually, without editorializing. But when he finished, he paused a beat longer than usual before he left the room. Daniel opened the leather journal. He'd written 1 word already, 2 weeks ago. He wrote a second one now, underlined it, loyal. Week 3 was over. And somewhere in Tulare, Luis Vega was making a phone call to a man who would not take the news well. Marco arrived on a Saturday morning with his second-hand backpack and his sister's eyes and the specific, effortful cheerfulness of a teenage boy trying not to be a burden. Elena held him for longer than she usually would. She didn't let him see that. She showed him the garden, the rows she'd coaxed back from cracked dirt, the tomatoes just beginning to climb their stakes. He said it was cool in the restrained way 17-year-olds said things were cool when they meant something more. She introduced him to Augusto, who nodded from his chair on the porch and said nothing. Marco was polite, careful. He kept a distance from the old man that Elena noticed and didn't comment on. At lunch, she watched him eat. He ate fast, the way people eat when they've been telling themselves they're not hungry for too many days in a row. "Have you been cooking?" she asked. "Yeah," Marco said, not looking up. "Marco," he shrugged. "It's fine." She asked it gently, the way she'd learned to ask things with patience when she already suspected the answer. He admitted it eventually. The UCLA application fee had been higher than he remembered, and he'd shifted his food money to cover it. Just for a couple weeks, he was managing. "You skipped meals," she said. "It's not a big deal." "It is," she said quietly. "It really is." That evening, after Marco's bus pulled away, Elena sat at the kitchen table alone. She reached up and touched the chain at her collar, a fine gold chain with a small medallion of the Virgin de Guadalupe, warm from her skin. Her mother had worn it every day of her adult life. When she died, there was almost nothing to leave. There was this. Elena touched it for a while. Then she went to bed. The next morning, she drove to a pawn shop in Visalia. It was a small place with a buzzing fluorescent light and a man behind the counter who examined the necklace with practiced indifference. When he quoted her $340, she thought about whether it was enough and decided it would have to be. The clerk asked if she was sure. "My mother would have sold it herself," Elena said, "if she'd seen him hungry." She wired the money to Marco before she pulled out of the parking lot. The note said, "For food, no arguments. E." She didn't tell Augusto. She didn't tell Ray. She stopped at a gas station on the way back and sat in the parking lot for a while before she drove home. That night, while Elena slept, Daniel came into the kitchen for a glass of water and noticed the crumpled receipt on top of the trash. He smoothed it flat on the counter. Read it slowly. 1 gold necklace with medallion, $340. Visalia Pawn and Trade. He had seen her touch that chain. He'd noticed it more than once, her fingers going to her collarbone during the quiet moments, the way people touch something they're afraid of losing. He didn't open the journal. He just sat there in the dark kitchen, holding a crumpled piece of paper for a very long time. In his Tulare office on the Monday of week 5, Hector Medina sat behind his desk with the expression of a man recounting money that should have been his. Luis had failed. The shopkeeper's scheme, which Hector had expected to take 3 days, had produced nothing except, apparently, a public display of Elena's loyalty that a dozen grocery customers had witnessed firsthand. He'd heard about it secondhand and liked it less each time. He'd started digging into the Carrillo estate properly. The county records weren't detailed, but what he could find suggested hundreds of acres under Carrillo land holdings, mineral rights, agricultural easements. The property wasn't worth what he'd estimated. It was worth much more, which meant he needed control, and he needed it before Elena got any ideas. Charm had failed. He needed something that could follow Elena into her actual life. He found Carlos through a mutual contact, late 20s, handsome in the uncomplicated way that photographs well, easy with people, willing to work for a reasonable figure with no questions asked. Hector told him what he needed: befriend the wife, get close, get a photograph, anything that could be framed as infidelity. An annulment based on misconduct gave Hector the legal opening he was looking for. Carlos showed up at the edge of the Carrillo property the following Wednesday, introducing himself over the fence as a farmhand from the spread next door. Elena was working the garden. She was polite. She offered him water through the fence. He complimented her rouse. He came back Thursday. Friday. He was patient. He had a good manner, unhurried, warm, attentive in the way that felt like being truly seen. He was around her own age, which Hector had calculated carefully. He offered to help with the garden. He asked about her life with a gentleness that almost sounded real. Elena kept working. She answered his questions briefly. She mentioned Augusto without complaint, without bitterness, in the same matter-of-fact way she mentioned the weather. When Carlos steered the conversation toward herself, what she wanted, whether she was happy, whether this was really the life she'd imagined, she redirected, not unkindly, but clearly. By the following Tuesday, Carlos had run out of patience. He reached for her hand. He said they should meet somewhere, just the two of them, just to talk. Elena stepped back. She looked at him directly, not with anger, something quieter. "I know what loneliness feels like," she said, "and I know what a trap looks like. You feel like both." Carlos didn't argue. He left. He called Hector that afternoon and said it wasn't going to happen. Hector listened, set down the phone, put both hands flat on his desk. Charm hadn't worked. Temptation hadn't worked. Every soft approach had run up against the same wall. A woman who kept her word for reasons he genuinely couldn't calculate, because he had never once in his life kept his word for reasons that weren't transactional. He needed leverage she couldn't refuse. He reached for a different drawer. Week 5 was over, and what came next wouldn't be soft at all. He didn't call first. That was the first sign. Hector never arrived anywhere without announcing himself, because announcing yourself was a form of control. The fact that he pushed through the gate on a Tuesday morning without warning meant he decided control wasn't something he needed to perform anymore. Ray was at the fence line when the car came up the drive. He stepped into the path. Hector walked around him like he wasn't there. Elena heard the door. She came out of the kitchen to find Hector already in the front room, shoes polished, half smile in place, looking around the house the way a man looks at something he's calculating a price for. He told her he needed to speak with her privately. When Augusto didn't move from his chair, Hector's smile thinned. He turned his back to the old man completely, as if he'd already ceased to matter. "Sit down, Elena," he said. She didn't sit. He dropped the performance then, slowly, deliberately, like a man setting down a mask he was tired of wearing. He told her he had never filed the deed transfer for Rosa's house. The property was still in his name, had been the whole time. He could put it on the market by Friday if he wanted to. He told her he was pulling Rosa's medical funding, effective immediately, unless Elena did what he was asking. And he told her about the power of attorney, a document he claimed gave him authority over Augusto's affairs through the trust arrangement, which meant he could initiate the annulment himself if she wouldn't. He slid papers across the kitchen table. "Sign," he said pleasantly. "Walk away clean. This was always too much for a girl like you." Elena looked at the papers. She thought about Rosa in a rehabilitation bed. She thought about the house Rosa talked about going home to. She thought about Marco and the fraying backpack and the skipped meals. She thought about all of it. Then she looked up at Hector. "No," she said. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward. "You don't understand what I can take from you." "You should leave," she said, "before you say something worse." He left. But before he reached the door, he turned and looked at her one last time. Really looked at her, with the contempt he usually kept just beneath the surface, and said what he actually thought, quietly, like he was doing her a favor. "You're nothing, Elena. You were nothing before this marriage, and you'll be nothing after." The door closed. She made it to the garden before she broke. She crouched among her tomato plants with dirt under her fingernails and sobbed into her hands, her shoulders shaking, the California sun indifferent above her. She didn't know how long she stayed there. When she came inside, the kitchen was quiet. Augusto was still in his chair. But on the table in front of her empty seat sat a cup of chamomile tea, still steaming. His hands must have shaken the whole time he made it. There was a small spill on the saucer. He had already shuffled back to his room. Elena sat down. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup, and she cried again. But differently this time. Not from despair, from something she hadn't expected to feel in this house. Being seen. Behind his closed door, Daniel set down the phone he'd been holding for the last 10 minutes. He dialed a San Francisco number from memory. His chief counsel picked up on the second ring. "I need everything on Hector Medina," Daniel said. "Every license, every transaction, every lie. Pull his power of attorney claim. It doesn't exist, but I want proof he's been using it. You have 5 days." He ended the call and sat in the silence of his room, the disguise laid across the chair in the corner, the leather journal closed on the nightstand. 5 days. Elena didn't tell Marco. She called him that evening and said everything was fine. She asked about school. She laughed at something he said. When she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while looking at nothing, then got up and made breakfast for the next morning so it would be ready. That was how she handled things that were too big to handle. She made breakfast. She watered the garden. She moved through her routine like it was a rope she was following in the dark. She wrote the letters on Wednesday evening, 3 of them, on plain paper from the drawer by the telephone. The first was to Marco. She told him to stay in school no matter what happened, that the application to UCLA was worth every skipped meal, and she was sorry about the meals, that he was going to be fine even in a world that didn't have her in it. The second was to Rosa. She described the garden at the ranch, the tomato rows, the marigolds she'd planted along the eastern fence, hoping Rosa could picture it. She said she was proud to be her granddaughter. The third was to Augusto, and it was the shortest. She thanked him for the tea. She folded them and left them in the drawer, just in case. Meanwhile, Daniel worked. He stayed in character through the days. The stooped shuffle, the raspy whisper, Augusto's gruffness slowly softening into something harder to name. Sealed document packages traveled from Ray's hands to a courier to Meridian Global's legal team in San Francisco. Phone calls happened behind a locked door. The investigation into Hector Medina was building the way investigations do, quietly, methodically, one receipt at a time. One evening, Daniel asked Elena what she would want, if she could have anything. She was quiet for a long time. She looked out the kitchen window at the garden, at the rows she'd pulled back from nothing. "For Marco to finish school," she said finally. "For Rosa to keep her house." A pause. "Maybe a garden that's really mine someday." Daniel waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Not a word about freedom, not a word about money. Not herself at all, except for the garden, and even that she'd framed as a maybe. He didn't write in the journal that night. There was no word that covered it. 2 evenings later, Elena noticed Augusto's overcoat hanging on the peg by the door, the heavy one he wore on cooler mornings. A seam at the left shoulder had split, a gap 2 inches long where the thread had given out. She could have left it, or replaced it. Instead, she took it to the kitchen table, found a needle and thread in the sewing tin she'd brought from her suitcase, and sat under the lamp and stitched the seam closed with small, careful passes. No one was watching. She didn't say anything to anyone. She just murmured to herself while she worked that the coat had good bones, that it had character, that things worth keeping were worth the extra time. Then she hung it back on the peg and went to bed. The night before Hector's deadline, Elena laid her dark blue dress on the chair by her door, the same dress from the wedding, still her only good one. And in his locked study, Daniel made a final call to San Francisco. "Tomorrow," he said, "have everything ready." Hector had chosen an event hall on the east side of Tulare, the kind of space used for quinceañeras and retirement parties, with folding chairs and round tables and a small riser at one end. He'd invited a dozen family members, cousins, an aunt who'd always deferred to him, a notary with a briefcase and a professional neutrality that asked no questions. He told them Elena was unhappy, that the marriage had been a mistake, that he was stepping in as family to help her find a way out. He'd framed himself as the concerned uncle, and he'd had years of practice at that particular role. Elena walked in wearing her dark blue dress. Not because she had nothing else. She had a change of clothes in the car. She'd chosen the dress deliberately, the same way she'd chosen her word that night 8 weeks ago when she called Hector back. It was the one act of defiance available to her, and she wore it quietly without announcement. Marco was there, confused, sitting near the back with his arms folded, watching everything. No one had told him what the meeting was actually for. Hector greeted Elena with his professional warmth, the hand on the shoulder, the expression arranged into concern, and steered her to the center table where the annulment papers waited. He addressed the room briefly. A marriage entered under difficult circumstances, a young woman deserving of her life back, a family coming together to support her. He was very good at this. He slid the papers in front of her, offered her a pen. Elena looked at the papers. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone is watching something and no one wants to be the one to speak. She reached for the pen, and then the double doors at the back of the hall opened. The sound reached her before she turned. Not a crash or a shout, but the simple click and swing of a door opening with purpose. She turned slowly. Augusto was standing in the doorway, but he wasn't stooped. He was upright. Both feet planted, shoulders back, walking without the cane, each step measured and deliberate, crossing the floor with the quiet authority of a man who had never actually needed help walking. Behind him, 3 people in dark suits carrying briefcases, and Ray, not in ranch clothes, not playing caretaker, wearing a blazer, an earpiece, and the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to be exactly where he was. The room erupted in whispers. Hector let out a short, nervous laugh. "What is this? Old man, sit down before you fall and embarrass yourself." Augusto stopped at the center of the room. He raised his hands slowly, reached up, removed the thick glasses, then with 2 fingers peeled away the prosthetic nose, then lifted the wide-brimmed hat from his head. The room watched a 70-year-old man become someone else entirely. 31 years old, sharp-featured, dark-eyed, standing in a tailored charcoal suit with his hands at his sides and his face completely still. Elena's pen dropped from her fingers. It hit the table with a small, clear sound, and the room held its breath. The whispers moved through the room like wind through dry grass. Daniel stood at the center of the hall in his charcoal suit, and the family members who had come to watch Elena sign her name were now looking at a 31-year-old they didn't recognize and couldn't place. Hector's face cycled through several things in quick succession: confusion, calculation, the first cold finger of fear. Before settling on a bluster, he didn't quite have enough conviction to sell. "I don't know who you are," Hector said, "but this is a family matter." "My name is Daniel Carrillo," Daniel said, "founder and CEO of Meridian Global. You've been corresponding with my attorneys for 3 months." He let that sit for a moment. "You never thought to look further than the shell entity." Hector's mouth opened, closed. Daniel turned to Elena first. Not to Hector, to Elena. He opened a folder and laid the first document on the table in front of her, but he spoke to the room. He told them about the grocery store in week 3, a man named Luis Vega, Hector's contact, who had suggested Elena help herself to the estate's financial records. He produced Ray's eyewitness account, signed and dated. Ray had been standing outside and heard every word. Elena had refused publicly, without hesitation. He placed a second document beside it. The tax envelope, $10,000 in cash, left unsealed on a kitchen counter, logged by the ranch bookkeeper as untouched, locked by Elena in the desk within minutes of finding it. A third document, a written statement from a man named Carlos, obtained by Meridian's investigators, confirming he had been hired by Hector Medina to manufacture evidence of infidelity, confirming that Elena had refused him the moment he crossed the line. The statement included the exact words she'd used. "I know what loneliness feels like, and I know what a trap looks like." One of the ants near the back made a small sound. Then Daniel reached into the folder and produced something smaller, a laminated slip of paper. He held it up and read it aloud, his voice steady and unhurried. "1 gold necklace, Virgin de Guadalupe medallion, $340. Visalia pawn in trade." He told the room what it meant. Her mother's only inheritance, sold for $340 and wired to her brother so he wouldn't go hungry. Without telling anyone, without asking for credit. Elena's hand rose to her bare collarbone and stayed there. Then Daniel reached beneath the table and lifted the overcoat. He turned it so the room could see the shoulder seam. 2 inches of careful close stitching in dark thread, neat and deliberate, the work of someone who had taken real time. "She mended this one evening," he said quietly, "when she thought no one would ever know." The room was completely still. Marco, near the back, had both hands pressed flat on the table, staring at his sister. Then Daniel turned to Hector. The attorneys opened their briefcases. What came out was not dramatic, it was methodical. The kind of destruction built not from one large blow, but from 100 small receipts laid in a row, until the picture they form is undeniable. The fraudulent power of attorney. A document that had never legally existed, bank records showing the bride price Hector had pocketed, the deed transfer he'd promised and never filed, wire transfers to Luis Vega and to Carlos, time-stamped and traceable, and beneath all of it, 5 years of real estate transactions involving forged signatures, a pattern so consistent it had its own internal logic. "You sold your niece to a stranger," Daniel said, "for money you stole from the arrangement. Every agency that governs your license will have this file by morning. And that power of attorney you've been waving around? It doesn't exist. It never did. Which makes every document you've filed using it fraud." Hector reached for his phone. His hands were shaking too badly to dial. Not one family member moved toward him. Not one. The hall was still buzzing when Daniel appeared at Elena's shoulder and asked quietly if she would step outside with him. She went. The Tulare evening sky had turned violet at the edges, the last sun burning low over the foothills. The parking lot was empty. Elena stood with her arms crossed, not against cold, and looked at nothing in particular. Daniel stood a few feet away. No folder, no attorneys, no posture. Just a 31-year-old man who looked, for the first time in any form she'd known him, genuinely uncertain. He told her everything. He told her about Priya, her name, the relationship, the lawsuit that had cost him $60 million and something harder to price. He told her about the years after, the modest cover identities, the matchmakers, the therapist who said plainly that he was building walls no one could climb. He told her the disguise had been his last idea, and that part of him had half hoped it would fail so he could stop looking. He didn't excuse any of it. He told her directly that he had no right to treat her like a variable in an experiment, that Ray's reports, the things observed and cataloged without her knowledge, all of it was wrong. That she had passed every test was not the point. The method was the violation, regardless of the outcome. Elena was quiet through all of it. Her jaw was tight. When he finished, she spoke. The disguise she could understand, she said. Desperate people do desperate things, and she knew something about that. But having people report on her private choices, the grocery store, the envelope, the pawn receipt she'd thrown away specifically so no one would see it, that felt like being watched through a window she didn't know was there. And that, she said, was its own kind of wrong. Daniel didn't defend himself. He said she was right. The sky deepened. Somewhere down the street, sprinklers ran. Elena looked at the foothills for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was measured, the voice she used when she meant every word. I didn't stay because you were testing me, she said. I stayed because I gave my word. If you want to be worth that word, don't start this marriage with a lie still between us. Start it with the truth, all of it, from now on. Daniel reached into his jacket. He held out a small velvet box. She opened it. The chain was gold and delicate, the Virgin de Guadalupe medallion gleaming, cleaned, restored, every scratch buffed away, as if it had never left her mother's neck. Elena held it against her chest, then she reached up and clasped it around her own throat, her fingers steady, and then, for the first time, not in a locked bathroom, not crouched in a garden, not alone in the dark, she let him see her cry, open, unguarded, the tears of someone choosing to be seen. Daniel didn't reach for her. He just stood there and witnessed it, the way she had witnessed him for 8 weeks, and let it be what it was. After a while, she wiped her face and turned toward the door. He fell into step beside her, not as strangers, not yet as something they had a word for, but as two people who had agreed to begin from the truth, and meant it. Hector's phone rang on a Tuesday morning 9 days later, the California Bureau of Real Estate, a formal voice, words like suspended and pending investigation and fraudulent deed transfers. He stood in his Tulare office with the phone to his ear and said very little because there was very little left to say. By Thursday, his landlord had seen the news and padlocked the office door. By Monday, 3 former clients had filed complaints with the state, and 2 more were consulting attorneys. The fraudulent power of attorney claim alone carried the possibility of criminal charges. Hector had spent years building a reputation carefully enough that no single mistake could topple it. But Meridian's investigators hadn't found one mistake. They'd found a pattern. 5 years of them, and a pattern is a different thing entirely. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, a Meridian attorney walked into Mercy Southwest Hospital with a folder and walked out having completed the legal transfer of Abuela Rosa's house deed, properly filed, properly recorded, in Rosa's name alone. Irrevocable. Done. Elena drove to the rehabilitation facility that afternoon. She sat beside Rosa's bed and took the weathered hands, so much like her own, the same calluses carried across 2 generations of labor, and told her. The house was hers, truly hers. No conditions, no Hector, no debt attached to it. Rosa didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her fingers tightened around Elena's and held on. 2 days later, Daniel drove to Marco's high school. No attorneys, no entrance. He bought 2 sandwiches at the gas station down the street and sat on a bench outside the gym and waited. Marco came out after practice, saw him, and stopped. He sat down, not close, but not far, and didn't touch the sandwich. He looked at Daniel the way he looked at every man who had ever held power over his family, steady, wary, measuring everything. "Why did you pretend to be someone else?" he asked. Daniel didn't dress it up. Because the last person who saw who I really was only saw the money, he said. Your sister never saw the money once. She just saw a man who needed someone to make him tea and stitch his coat. Marco sat with that, looked at the sandwich, picked it up. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a door left open instead of shut, and for now, that was enough. That evening, Elena and Daniel sat on the ranch porch as the sun dropped behind the foothills and the garden she'd planted during the disguise. Weeks rustled in the evening air. Elena had a legal pad on her knee. She was writing names and numbers and categories, the shape of something that didn't exist yet but was already real in her mind. Daniel watched her write. He didn't ask what it was. He already knew she'd tell him when she was ready, and whatever it was, he had already decided the answer was yes. 2 months later, Elena stood at a podium in Tulare's Civic Center and looked out at 200 people. She had written and rewritten the speech 4 times. In the end, she threw out the 4th version and said what was true. She told them about the number $94,000. She told them about $2,300. She told them about sitting in a hospital parking lot, doing math on her phone, and understanding, in the specific and terrible way that only arithmetic can teach you, that the numbers didn't come close. She didn't tell it as a story about hardship survived or luck received. She told it as a calculation, the kind every family in that room had run in some form, at some kitchen table, at some 2 a.m. when the bill came and the account balance didn't move. Nobody should have to sell their mother's necklace to feed their brother, she said. Her voice was steady. That's not a story about courage. It's a story about a broken system. We're here to fix the system. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. The Carrillo Vasquez Foundation's first act was announced that afternoon. Outstanding medical debt for 12 families, identified through Mercy Southwest Hospital, totaling $1.1 million. Cleared, forgiven, done. 12 families who had been doing the same arithmetic Elena once did, and who would now get to stop. Then they called Marco's name. He walked to the stage in a button-down shirt Elena had pressed that morning without telling him she'd pressed it. He hugged her, the kind of hug that lasts a second longer than necessary, and then turned and shook Daniel's hand, firmly, with eye contact, the inaugural scholarship, a full ride to UCLA's engineering program, 4 years, all of it covered. Marco didn't cry. He pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and that was the same thing. That evening, after the chairs were folded and the local press had packed up their cameras, the 4 of them stood in the garden Elena had planted during the week she'd lived at the ranch as a stranger's wife. The tomatoes climbing their stakes now, the marigolds burning orange along the eastern fence, the whole thing fuller and wilder and more alive than she'd dared hope when she first turned that cracked dirt over with a rusted trowel. Rosa sat in her wheelchair at the garden's edge, with a blanket on her lap, and the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to see things come right. Marco stood as witness. Ray stood at the edge of the porch. When Elena and Daniel exchanged their vows again, quietly, without ceremony, just the words said plainly between 2 people who meant them, Ray turned his face toward the garden and stayed very still for a moment. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed him reach up once and press 2 fingers briefly to the corner of his eye. No one mentioned it. Daniel's name was on the foundation's accounts, and the infrastructure was his. But the foundation's title was hers first, Carrillo Vasquez, in that order, because he had insisted. She was executive director. The converted office on the ranch property had her name on the door. Out across the Civic Center parking lot, the foundation's banner caught the late afternoon wind and held. 1 year later, the numbers told their own story. 412 families served. A woman named Dolores, whose cardiac surgery the foundation had covered in full, now sat at the intake desk 3 mornings a week, helping other families fill out their applications in the same steady handwriting she'd once used to write letters to her children, explaining why she couldn't have the operation. A 17-year-old named Jesus was finishing his first semester at Fresno State. the first in his family to attend college, on a Carrillo Vasquez scholarship, calling his mother every Sunday from his dorm room. 3 community gardens Elena had planted in Tulare neighborhoods were producing food for local families through the fall harvest, tended by volunteers who had started showing up on their own without being asked. Marco was finishing his freshman year at UCLA. He called Elena every Sunday, too. He was already talking about interning at Meridian Global over the summer, and when he mentioned it, he said it with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided to stop being surprised by good things. Rosa was home. Her own house. The deed framed and hung on the wall above the entryway table, where she could see it every morning. A live-in nurse who made her coffee the way she liked it. A garden Elena had helped her plant that spring, modest and tended and full of the chilies Rosa had always grown herself, the independence she'd almost lost, given back in every form that health allowed. Hector's brokerage was permanently shut down. His license had not been reinstated, and the state's investigation had concluded with findings that made reinstatement unlikely. He worked a sales counter at a Home Depot in Modesto now. Name tag, polo shirt, loading bags of mulch into customers' carts. There was a television in the break room. One afternoon it ran a local news segment about the Carrillo Vasquez Foundation's 1-year anniversary. Hector glanced at it. Then he looked away and went back to work, and that was the entirety of what remained of him. On a Saturday morning in April, Elena was sorting through the hallway closet at the ranch when she found it at the back, behind a row of boxes. The oversized coat, the wide-brimmed hat balanced on top of it, and tucked in the coat's breast pocket, folded carefully, the thick glasses. She stood there for a moment, then she laughed, a real laugh. Full and unguarded, the kind that starts in the chest and takes over before you can stop it, the kind she couldn't have made a year ago, in this house, in this life that hadn't quite been hers yet. She carried the bundle to the living room where Daniel was reading. She draped the coat over his shoulders, tugged the hat down onto his head, stepped back and looked at him. "I think I liked you better in this," she said. Daniel looked up at her over the rims of imaginary glasses. "You're the only person in the world," he said, "who would mean that." He pulled her close. Outside, the garden was in full bloom. The one she had started with a rusted trowel and a stubborn belief that things worth keeping were worth the extra time. The Tulare sun was dropping toward the foothills, painting the sky in the colors of late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look the way it was always supposed to look. Some people are tested by hardship, some are tested by power, but the ones worth finding, the truly rare ones, are the ones who stay good when no one is watching, who keep their word when breaking it would be easier, who give without keeping a ledger and love without making it a transaction. Elena Vasquez had always been that person. She just hadn't known yet that someone was paying attention. Now she did. And if this story reminded you that hidden goodness deserves to be seen, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.